Well, hello, everybody, to the fifth installment of the Academic Tradecraft Workshop. I'm Mark Goodale, Leverhulme Trust Visiting Professor this year at the University of Oxford. And this is the fifth of six of these workshops over the course of the year. And there will be one more, which I will be presenting in about a month. So the topic today is, or the title is Lemonade from Lemons, Dealing with Disappointment in Academia. And what I want to talk about today is something that you probably wouldn't think of as a skill, as something that was typically part of this academic tradecraft series. But nevertheless, I think that the question of disappointment is extremely important. And in fact, that there are some skills, some strategies that you can adopt in grappling with the experience of disappointment. Now, just as a caveat, when I talk about disappointment in academia, I don't mean disappointment with academia, which is another category, another issue. So what I mean about disappointment within academia is the experience of being disappointed, which is a normal part of an academic career, an unavoidable part. And by disappointment, what I mean in general is just when things don't go your way. And this could be in one way or another, in both expected and unexpected ways, and everything in between. And as I've done with the other academic tradecraft workshops, there's also an argument behind this theme. And the argument that I'm making is that the experience of disappointment is a completely normal part of an academic career. And in fact, it's an unavoidable part. So what I want to argue is that this doesn't mean that you're a failure, or that when things go against you, that there's something wrong with you, that there's something wrong with the choices that you've made, that there's something wrong with the direction that your career is taking. No, what I want to say is, paradoxically, the experience of disappointment, this normal experience of disappointment, should actually be taken as a positive sign, a sign of a kind of dynamism. And that's because it's a sign that you are taking risks. Nevertheless, when we talk about academic disappointment, it's usually done in very informal ways. You know, I'm on Twitter, now known as X, as I discussed during the last academic tradecraft on self-curation. And so, you know, people vent, let's say, about their experiences of things not going their way. So these discussions take place, obviously. They take place in more personal spaces with your loved ones, with your friends, with your family, and so on. But it's not a formal part of what we talk about. You know, we don't take classes, we don't teach classes in Introduction to Academic Disappointment, and then maybe later you get to take a class or teach a class in advanced topics in academic disappointment. So, and so I think that's a problem. I think that it is such a normal and unavoidable and even common part of our experience as academics that I think more thought, more feeling, perhaps, more collective reflection should be put into this category. So as I've done before, I'm going to try to break down this idea of disappointment, the experience of disappointment, into several categories. And then I'm going to offer some final thoughts. And I want to suggest that not only do these different categories have a certain pattern about them, that is, patterns that apply to people across academia, no matter what the discipline is, and even no matter what the stage of your career is. But I also want to suggest that there are patterns within these categories. So as you'll see, I'm going to talk about three categories. I'm going to discuss three categories, and there are patterns within these. And I want to, if there's some truth in this, I want to call this the reverse Anna Karenina phenomenon. I'm just partly joking, but what I mean is that if you remember the famous first line of Tolstoy's novel Anna Karenina, he starts, depending on the translation, of course, he starts off with something like, "Happy families are all alike." but every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Now, for academic disappointment, I think it's the reverse. I think actually that happiness, joy, and so on is actually very idiosyncratic for academics. I'm not going to sort of lay my stake on arguing that that's the case or insisting that that's the case, but my sense is that that's the case. However, unlike the reverse of Anna Karenina, the experience of disappointment has a certain pattern. It's not that it's all experiences of disappointment are alike, but there are patterns. And if that's true, then I think that we can learn collectively from reflecting on what those patterns are and maybe developing some strategies to grapple with them, to deal with them. So now, before I tell you what these categories are, it's important to understand that the experience of academic disappointment, being disappointed, things going against you, it's not a phase. It's not something that you pass through. You start your career and you come up against all sorts of roadblocks, applications don't go through, and then finally you pass through a sort of golden door and you're into this phase for the rest of your career where nothing goes against you. No, as I said, this experience of things going against you is a permanent part of an academic career. And in fact, for more senior colleagues, it's interesting because it means that you are still taking risks, even if, because of the differences, obviously, between stages in a career, it's not strictly necessary to take those risks at that particular time. So to be disappointed means you are taking risks. Again, this paradox of seeing disappointment as a positive sign. And personally, I've been and continue to be on both sides of this. I'm responsible for delivering disappointing news in one way or another as a reviewer, in my capacity as a director of a laboratoire. There are various ways in which I have to deliver that disappointing news, but I'm also very frequently the recipient of disappointing news. And I think this makes you sensitive to what it means, what this experience is, and what the consequences or the effects can be over time. So, as I said, what I've done throughout all of the workshops is that I've broken down this, in this case, the experience of disappointment into several categories, and they are scholarly, a category of scholarly disappointment, a category of support disappointment, and the dreaded category of career disappointment. So let me start with the category of scholarly disappointment. Now, there are many different kinds of forms of scholarly disappointment, but I want to focus just on one to give you a sense of what I mean. So this is a sense of the experience of having an article rejected, okay? Now, if you go back and remember or if you've watched the workshop on revise and resubmit, in that workshop, I have a long discussion breaking down the different phases of submitting an article, of getting an article back, of responding to the comments, of negotiating with editors. It's a long process. But it doesn't always mean that the article in the end is going to be published, obviously. Sometimes it's the contrary. Sometimes it's more likely than not that no matter what you do, and no matter how careful you are with your revisions, no matter how focused you are on making sure that the theme of your article aligns with the journal's mission, et cetera, the article can be rejected. Not sort of what they call rejected, which means it's not even put under review, but at the end of what can be a long process of peer review. And as many of you know, especially after the COVID pandemic, the process of peer review has gotten even longer for different kinds of reasons. So this can be a particularly disappointing result. So what to do? So here, and again, as I said, this is inevitable. Articles are going to be rejected at the end of a process of submission and revise and resubmit. It could be 2 rounds of revise and resubmit. You will have articles rejected. Okay, so you'll be sitting there with this article. that you've been working on sometimes for 1 year or 2 years, which is itself based on research that you've been working on. You've done your best to respond to the reviewers. It's a very mature, I won't say it's the best article it could be, because that's as you know, it's very subjective, and you've been working with different specific reviewers. So what do? So my advice, or my own approach, is to try again, because if you watch the academic tradecraft on revise and resubmit, what you know is that despite the, say, theoretical image of revise and resubmit and the publication or not of articles as an iterative process of knowledge production, a linear process of knowledge production, in fact, it isn't. It's highly specific and highly contextual. It depends on the reviewers. It depends on the particular editors of a journal. So if different editors at the same journal, the review process will look different. So what that means is that if you're willing, and I'm saying you should be willing, you can take that article, which was, without any question, better than it was when you submitted it 1.5 years ago, and go through the same process with another journal. Now, of course, it's not guaranteed that it's going to get published at the end of another process, but it's probably more likely, because the article probably is better. There were arguments, there were gaps that you didn't notice that were pointed out by the reviewers, given what I called in the other workshop the hobby horse phenomenon problem, where each reviewer wants you to do things in a certain kind of way, and that will vary by reviewer. But leaving all of that aside, it's probably more likely than not that the article is better than it was. So when you submit it to a second journal, it's probably more likely that it will, at least the reviewers won't identify the same issues. And what you can do is look at that as a kind of collective process of making the article as good as it can be. In other words, your intellectual effort, your thought, plus the reviewers, plus the editor's comments, plus you again then reflecting on maybe the final comments when the article was rejected and taking those on board, and then revising yet again. So it is a collective process at this point. So others have helped you produce an article, which, if it, as we hope it will, see the light of day, it will be a better article than it was before. And also, this is a moment after the article gets rejected to think about the journal that you submitted to. Not all journals receive the same number of submissions. Not all journals are as competitive in that sense as others. So this might be a time to think about a journal which you believe doesn't get as many submissions, which perhaps will be more willing to take your article on board. But there's absolutely no question in my mind that an article which has been rejected once and maybe even twice should eventually see the light of day. It is better to publish the article even in a journal that is more obscure, or that is not your first choice, second, or even third choice in terms of the kind of impact you want to make. It's much better for that article to see the light of day than just to sit on your desktop or in your computer. Get your article out there, get this much more mature piece of work out there, and let others decide. Let the publics, your academic publics decide about the article. Okay, so that is a few thoughts. Those are a few thoughts about scholarly disappointment. And of course, as you can imagine, there are many other subcategories. So now let me say something about support. Now, by support, what I'm thinking of is mostly research funding. Okay. Now, there are different people who are participating virtually in this workshop. People who are coming from fields in which research funding is not as important as others. So, granted. However, so I'm thinking about here people who need research funding to advance research. And here again, disappointment is absolutely inevitable. it is inevitable in the area of research funding. You are going to be disappointed. Things are not going to go your way. That is absolutely inevitable. And especially if you're regularly seeking funding for your research, and in between parentheses, you should be regularly seeking funding for your research. I mean, year after year after year after year, there should be research applications for research grants, which are regularly being prepared, regularly being submitted. If you go back and if you think about what I talked about during the academic simultaneity workshop, the concept of working on something, these projects that you identify over in these 6-month increments, research funding proposals, grant proposals should be regularly part of what you're working on. However, if you are regularly working on and submitting research grants proposals, you are regularly going to be disappointed. It's going to be like clockwork. And compared to the journal, here the stakes are different. But they're also very high, because in the area of research funding, as most of you know, you're talking about decisions about awarding what can be large sums of funding, of money, from what are always very scarce or limited resources. Even in the most generous funding programs, you're always talking about decision making, and so over scarce resources. And sometimes it can be very scarce resources in terms of the percentages. It could be 10%, it could be 15%. So in that kind of competition, in that kind of world, you're going to be disappointed. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't be submitting grant proposals. On the contrary, you should be. But here, even more than rejected articles, I think that rejected funding proposals can and definitely should be taken forward, often with the same funders. Now, assuming that the changes are taken on board, okay, so it depends on the funding agency, but normally there are going to be reviews. There's going to be a letter explaining why your proposal wasn't selected, and those can be very helpful. But assuming that those changes have been taken on board, meaning in thinking about the future and the revisions, and assuming what we might call a judicious presentation. In other words, there's a strategy to how you revise a grant proposal, how you write the letter, very thankfully to the agency, explaining how your revised proposal very clearly responded to the reviewers. And here, compared to articles, revised grant proposals, this is not the time to argue with the reviewers, to say, well, I didn't, this is my grant proposal, my idea, and I'm sticking to it, and I refuse to follow this recommendation. I think with funding proposals in particular, this is the time. I'm not saying to be obsequious, but this is the time to take on everything on board, as much as you can, and then think very carefully about resubmitting to the same funding agency. So here it is. I can say this just with personal experience, again, on both sides of the process, that it is almost expected that a vast majority of the grant proposals are going to be rejected in a particular competition, in a year competition, and that the idea is that in the next competition, a percentage, maybe a high percentage of the funded proposals are going to be proposals from the prior competition that have been revised, improved, and resubmitted. And what I would say here is that when it comes to funding proposals, and again, I'm thinking now mostly on the reviewer side of things, there's almost a kind of ethical dimension which enters into it, both from the reviewers, who might get the proposal again the next year, ideally, and the funding agency. It's the idea that, much less so than in journals, if somebody doesn't get their article published, there's much less of a feeling of an ethical dilemma, let's say. But with funding, 4 or 5 year funding proposals, large funding proposals, which are going to be career defining in some cases, there seems to be an ethical dimension. I know personally as a reviewer, when I am a year later, of course, I most likely will have forgotten about the reviews that I've done. But if I am contacted by an agency, a funding agency, to say, Professor Goodale, would you Would you like to review this year's? We have one proposal which you reviewed last year. I look at it very carefully. I go back and refresh what I said the year before. And if I see the applicant, as I said, the ethical dilemma, and I'm just speaking personally, I don't know what others do, but if I see the applicant making a concerted effort to improve, to modify the grant proposal, I almost don't have to reread the whole thing from cover to cover or word for word. If it seems clear that those changes were taken on board, then I'm almost instinctively very positive the next time. And I think that's true of others who are doing a lot of grant reviewing. But of course, there are no guarantees. And even though you are doing what I've just said, the issues of scarcity of resources, the issues about the difficulty don't go away. So even if you do your best to take on board those recommendations, and the competition or the percentage is still 15% or 20% or whatever it is the next year, it still doesn't guarantee you're going to get it. But I would say that in terms of dealing with the disappointment of having a funding proposal rejected, what I would say is this is absolutely no question that you should, in fact, when you prepare your grant proposal in year A, you should almost assume it's going to be rejected. And so that you're thinking about a 2-year, a 3-year process, okay? All right, so finally we come to the most difficult category of academic disappointment. And this is the category of careers. So just a few preliminary remarks. Why is this such a difficult category? There are several reasons, I think, but most importantly, it's because here the stakes are both different than the other categories and huge, okay? And you'll see what I mean in a second. And I also think that here, the stage in your career does matter. As I've said various times, sometimes, often, the stage of the career doesn't matter. That senior scholars, junior scholars, precarious scholars, and others are grappling with revise and resubmit. They're grappling with funding proposals. But here, the issue of disappointment in the career, it does matter which stage you're in. So when I think about the stakes, thinking about the first permanent position, here in the UK, apparently there's no tenure anymore, so they talk about permanent positions. So when you're hired in a first position, they call it, if it's a permanent position, which must be an institutional budgetary category as well, that's de facto tenure. In the United States and other countries, there is a process of review in which you have to be reviewed after 6 years, let's say, and at that point, it's decided whether you have a guaranteed position. But getting that first position, whether it's permanent, tenure track, or whatever, that is a critical moment. And it's different than when you're, say, a full professor. When you're a full professor, wherever you are, it usually means you have job security, and also there are evaluations depending on which country and which system you're in, but there's more stability at the full professor level. But it doesn't mean that full professors are not also looking for different jobs or considering career moves. That happens, but it often is more of a horizontal, a lateral move. So, and it's not necessary. I mean, it's not absolutely necessary. If you have job security in University A, it's not absolutely necessary that you try and obtain a job at a similar rank at University B, even though that might be something that you are interested in. Okay, so the stakes are different. I'm also not talking in this category about things like promotion. You have a job and you're going through the process of promotion, and there's disappointment that happens along in that category. So that's something else. And then there are lots of other subcategories of career disappointment, and you can imagine what they are. But I'm talking mostly about what it means to deal with the disappointment and that comes from looking for that first job. And as I'm sure all of you who are academics in one level or another know, those permanent positions are becoming more scarce for different kinds of institutional reasons. And so in a way, now in 2024, the percentages, the competition and so on is looking like the grant applications. This is, in other words, submitting a job application for an assistant professorship or a lectureship. It's much more likely than not that you're going to be disappointed, no matter who you are. Just statistically, quantitatively, if there's one position and 250 or 300 people are applying for that position, or 70 people or 50 people, it doesn't matter what it is. It's just statistically very difficult to sort of get through the eye of that needle, let's say. So disappointment is also, especially when you're applying widely for the first job, and you're looking around, you're thinking about where you might want to work and who might want you to work for them. Of course, which is probably more important than your own desire. You should just expect that disappointment is going to follow that process. You're sending maybe dozens of applications. I mean, depending on what field they're in, there might be dozens of assistant or professorships or permanent positions. In some fields, there might be far fewer, but anyway, you're applying widely, and so is everybody else. So again, it's a category in which disappointment comes like clockwork. And what I want to do is I want to share with you an anecdote, an experience. I've had a lot of disappointment in this area. When I was first looking for a permanent position, this was a little over 20 years ago, was exactly in that same position. I was submitting applications widely, getting rejection letters, sometimes getting interviewed, and so on. And it was a period of my life where there was a lot of, I guess it's that way for everybody, a lot of hope, optimism. You're younger, you're relatively, although I wasn't so young when I finished my PhD, but you're just starting out. Anything is possible, and then suddenly you see that anything is not possible. So it's a time in my life that is you'll hear I have mixed feelings about. But I want to share with you an experience of mine, just so that you know how it happened for me. So I applied in this is again 20 years ago, over 20 years ago. I was in not a postdoc, but I was in a first position, which was not permanent. So that 2-year position was coming to an end, and I needed to find in the United States what's called the tenure track position. So I applied widely, and I got to what they call the long short list at a particular place. And then I was invited to campus for interviews. Now, I'm not going to say which university it is, but what I can tell you is that it was a great university in a great city, in a great part of the world. And I mean, I was ecstatic. I mean, suddenly you're imagining yourself developing a career, living in this beautiful place, with interesting colleagues, great students, very dynamic, wider artistic and intellectual community around the university, an amazing part of the world, etc. So I go to this place, and this was taking place, I'm going to say, around November, early November. And I went to campus. I did all the things that you do, interview, schmoozing with people, going through the brutally exhausting multi-day North American style of academic job interviewing, dinners and individual meetings, and meetings with professors, and meetings with students, and meetings with administrators, and all of that, and did my job talk, which went reasonably well. I thought, good question, Q&A, and everything was great. So at the end of the process, the chair of the search committee drives me to the airport so that I can fly back to the place where I had this 2-year position, which was going to be coming to an end. We sort of got to the airport, and he didn't pull to the loading zone, but actually pulled into an area that was like the parking lot, and he turned his car off. I mean, I was a little nervous. I thought, what's going on here? So he pulls over and turns the car off. I'm in the front seat, and he turns to me and he looks at me, and as I said, it was a little bit intimate, like a little bit strange. I didn't know what was going to happen, but he said, Mark, I just want you to know before you leave that I've heard from everybody. We've had feedback already from your visit, and all I can say is everybody is extremely excited. And what I want to say to you is, I can tell you that the job is yours. And so you're going back, and I just want you to know that I think that this is in the bag. There are a few processes. We have to have a full meeting of the faculty, but what I can tell you from the search committee is this was a great visit. So congratulations. So, and then I get out of the car and I fly back to the place where I was living, and I was ecstatic. I told my wife, we had some very small children at the time. Okay, we're going to be moving to City X. This is going to be amazing. And I saw this, and this was nice. And it took me to this neighborhood, and we might look for a place to live over here. And it was just great. And I went on the internet, and I was searching for housing, and it was a done deal. I was, okay, this is great. It was difficult, but I made it through that little eye of the needle. And I'm going to have my first position in a university and a city, which is going to make me very happy. So this is the beginning of November, and 1 week turns into 2 weeks, and 2 weeks turns into 3 weeks. When we get into the weekend in the United States, we have an event called Thanksgiving, kind of a national festival. So Thanksgiving, we had family come to the place we were living, and all the family comes to visit us. And I'm haven't heard from this place in 3 weeks. What is happening? An email, no phone call, nothing. And now it's Thanksgiving. I've got people around, and of course, my wife knew that I was waiting for a phone call. And in those days, they were going to call you, not email you. So I was waiting for a phone call. And I was with family, we're having drinks before, and it was Thanksgiving Day. So we're waiting for the dinner, and the phone rings, and everybody kind of stops, and I pick up the phone, and it's Mark. Hi, this is so-and-so, the chair of the committee. Can you talk? And my heart just boom, 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 boom. And I said, okay. And I go back into the master bedroom, and we had this little walk-in closet. And I remember going into the walk-in closet, closing the door, and turning the light on, putting the phone up to my ear. I said, yes, so-and-so, nice to talk to you. I hope you're doing fine. Yes, Mark, it's been great. Sorry for the delay. And I said, well, what's happening? Well, and so he breaks the news. He says, Mark, I know that you had a great visit, and we talked about that. Thinking back to that strangely intimate moment at the airport. However, when we had the full faculty meeting, vote of the faculty, they overruled the vote of the search committee, and we've decided to go with another candidate. So, and I'm really sorry about that. I don't know what to say. This happens sometimes, but we wish you well, and all the best. We know it's going to be it's going to be great for you. The same sort of thing that you would expect. And I put the phone down, and I'm standing there in the closet, this walk-in closet. I've got guests in the other room waiting to have Thanksgiving. Of course, my wife is waiting for me to come out and announce this glorious news, which then we could tell the family, and we're moving to so-and-so. And I come out, and she sees my face. And I think I was almost crying. I mean, I was, or at least tearing up. I was so disappointed that I was in shock. I couldn't believe it. So I walk out, and I look at her, and I just go, and the look on my wife's face was similarly crestfallen. I mean, it was a traumatic moment. Okay. So I share with you this anecdote to let you know that even 20 years later, there's still a pang of bitterness when I think about that. It doesn't go away. It was a very difficult, almost traumatic moment. And, it's a cliche to say you shouldn't take it personally, but that's BS. Of course, you're going to take it personally. And especially with those kind of job searches in North America, which are very different than other parts of the world. When you come in and you spend multiple days and you look at real estate, and if you have children, you might look at nursery schools or whatever. You can already imagine yourself living in the place, becoming part of the community, and becoming part of the community of the department. Which is intentional. They want their finalists. You want your finalists to think that way, because either any of those 3 or 4 people might end up being your colleagues for the next 25 or 30 years. So it's inevitable in a way from the department, because of course they're selling their department to the person who will eventually be offered the position, who might have other offers. That's also possible. And so there's going to be an element there. Now, for those who are not offered, like I was, you're just cut out of the process, and that's it. But so it's impossible not to take it personally. And the other thing is as a strategy is, I think it's dangerous. I don't know, dangerous isn't the word, but I don't think it's the best idea to then start deluding yourself, kidding yourself that, oh, this didn't work out, but the ideal position is out there somewhere waiting for me. My destiny is to secure the perfect position as an academic, and I just have to keep at it. And it's not that you shouldn't look forward and keep trying. Obviously, I'm not saying that, but it's the idea that there is an ideal academic position out there for you. I don't think that's the case. Rather, I think it's better to think of a position which can be made ideal, or made acceptable, or made productive, or part of a flourishing academic career. It's up to you to make the most of whatever situation you eventually find yourself in at each stage and in each moment. So let me end with some final thoughts about disappointment and risk, and return to this idea. So you have to take risks as an academic in order to move your academic career forward in whatever way you envision it. It could be through teaching innovation, it could be through service, it could be through scholarship. However you envision your academic career, you have to take risks in order for that to happen, for it to move forward. Because otherwise, without taking risks, an academic career can easily stagnate, and it's something that I've seen a lot. But taking risks, as I've said, means by definition being disappointed, sometimes temporarily. In other words, for 6 months or 7 months when you're working on the revision to the article, and you put it back under review at a different journal, and it gets accepted. So you're disappointed, but maybe even in the process of revision, that disappointment has already faded. But sometimes, as you've just seen through this personal anecdote, the experience of disappointment can last for decades, maybe forever. So even though it can be difficult, I'll conclude, is you should come to expect disappointment. You should try to learn from it, and even in a way, come to embrace it. Because being disappointed means you're taking risks, and taking risks means, in a way, you are doing your best as you define it, which is all we can ask for ourselves as academics. So thank you, and I'm going to end.